To support us in providing more, subscribe to the channel now. "Stay in your truck, sir," he said. "We'll handle this." I nodded and watched as they secured the area. The guy in the cap was nowhere to be seen. I hadn't seen him leave, but he wasn't around anymore. One of the officers came back to take my statement. I told him everything, including the guy I'd seen. "Did you get a good look at him?" the officer asked. "Not really," I admitted. Baseball cap, lean, maybe 6 feet tall. Didn't see his face clearly. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "All right, we'll need you to stick around for a bit." I spent the next few hours talking to the cops, repeating my story. They asked if I had any enemies or if I thought someone might be targeting me. I laughed at the absurdity. "I'm just a truck driver," I said. "Who'd want to come after me?" They didn't have an answer, but took my information and told me to stay in touch. By the time they let me go, it was well past midnight. I decided to push through the last leg of my trip. The image of that dead man burned into my mind for weeks. Couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I pulled into a rest area, I scanned the shadows for that guy in the cap, but I never saw him again. Cops never contacted me either, and I never heard if they caught the guy. Life went on, but I changed, became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I guess you could say it was a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how routine life seems, danger can be just around the corner. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile and a baseball. Couple of months after that night, I found myself on another long haul, this time through the deserts of New Mexico. It was the kind of drive that gave you too much time to think. My mind kept wandering back to that rest area, blood, and the guy in the cap. I wondered if he was still out there somewhere, looking for his next victim. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I pushed it away. I had a job to do, and I couldn't afford to get spooked. One night, I pulled into a truck stop in the middle of nowhere. It was a bigger place with a diner and a small convenience store. There were a few other trucks parked, drivers inside getting a meal or some shut-eye. I decided to grab a coffee and maybe a piece of pie, something to break the monotony of the road. As I walked into the diner, the bell above the door jingled, and a few heads turned to look at me. Truckers are a tight-knit group, always curious about a new face. I found a seat at the counter and ordered my coffee and pie. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, brought my order and struck up a conversation. "Long haul?" she asked, pouring my coffee. "Yeah," replied. "Just passing through." She nodded, wiping down the counter. "Stay safe out there." "You hear about that murder a while back? Some trucker found a guy dead at a rest stop." My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, I heard about it," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Crazy stuff." She sighed. "World's a dangerous place. Gotta watch your back." I finished my coffee and pie, paid my bill, and headed back to my truck. As I walked across the parking lot, I noticed a figure standing by one of the trucks. He was tall, lean, and wore a baseball cap. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep walking, hoping he wouldn't notice me. I climbed into my cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my mirrors. The guy was gone. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Another trucker stretching his leg. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every rest stop, every diner, I kept my eyes peeled for that guy in the cap. He never showed up again. A year later, I decided to take a break from trucking. The road had lost its charm, and I needed a change. I took a job at a local warehouse, working regular hours and sleeping in my own bed. Life was good, but I never forgot that night. One evening, I was watching the news when a story caught my attention. Another trucker had found a body at a rest stop. The victim's throat slit, just like before. The police were looking for a suspect, described as tall, lean, and wearing a baseball cap. I turned off the TV and sat in silence, the memories flooding back. I knew it was him, the same guy who had haunted my thoughts for the past year. I wondered how many other victims were out there. How many more would fall before he was caught? Life goes on. Some things stay with you. I still drive past that rest area sometimes on my way to visit family or take a trip. Can't help but glance at the bathroom door, half expecting to see that trail of dark, dried liquid leading inside. It's a reminder that no matter how safe we think we are, danger is always lurking just out of sight, and sometimes it wears a friendly smile and a baseball cap. My name is Daryl Fletcher, and this happened to me on July 17th, 2009. I was a truck driver back then, driving long hauls across the country, a job I loved and hated in equal measure. Sure, you get to see the country, but the loneliness can be a killer. Anyway, I was on a run from Kansas City to some small town in Wyoming. I can't remember the name now. The route took me through back roads where you can go hours without seeing another soul. It was getting late, the sky turning a dark purple, and I decided to pull into a rest area I knew was about an hour ahead. One of those real out-of-the-way places where the facilities are pretty much just a bathroom, a couple of vending machines. I'd been driving since dawn and needed to stretch my legs and maybe catch a quick nap for the last leg of the trip. Pulled in, parked my rig, and noticed another truck already there. A dark blue Peterbilt. I didn't think much of it. Truckers often stopped here, got out, lit a cigarette, and took a deep breath of cooling air. Felt good to be out of the cab. As I walked towards the restrooms, I noticed something odd. Trail of what looked like dark, dried liquid leading from the truck to the bathroom. At first I thought it was oil, but it was too dark and too thick. Curiosity got the better of me, so I followed the trail. It led to the restroom door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. A sickly sweet odor mixed with the usual restroom stink. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw it. Man slumped against the wall, blood everywhere. His throat had been slit, and his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. I backed out, my heart pounding. I'd never seen anything like that before. I knew I had to call the cops. My cell was dead, and the payphone outside was out of order. Typical. I ran back to my truck, hoping to use my CB radio to call for help. As I fumbled with the mic, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone was coming out of the other truck. The guy was tall and lean, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He moved with a casual confidence that set my nerves on edge. I pretended not to see him, focusing on getting a signal out. I managed to reach another trucker who promised to relay my call to the authority. As I signed off, the man approached my truck. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm and even. "Yeah, just checking my route." I lied. He smiled, a slow, unsettling smile, just stretching my legs. I nodded and watched him walk towards the bathroom. My gut told me to get out of there, but I needed to wait for the pop. I kept the engine running, ready to bolt. Things got hairy. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually I saw the flashing lights of a patrol car. I flagged them down, and 2 officers stepped out. I told them what I'd seen, and they went to check the bathroom. Moments later, one of them came back, looking pale. It hit me then. This was the missing girl Jenny and Joe had mentioned. I shook my head. "Sorry, man, I haven't seen anyone. When did she go missing?" "A couple of days ago. We found her car by the old quarry, but no sign of her. Please, if you see anything, let us know." I nodded, giving him my best reassuring look. He handed me a flyer with her picture and some contact information. I took it, feeling a pang of sympathy. Losing a kid must be the worst thing imaginable. He thanked me and walked off into the night. I couldn't sleep after that. Something about his desperation got under my skin. I started thinking about my own life, people I'd lost touch with, the roads I'd traveled. I decided to take a look around the quarry in the morning, just to see if there was anything out of place. Not that I expected to find anything. What did I know about finding missing? Morning came, and I headed out to the quarry. It was an old abandoned site, overgrown with weeds, and littered with broken equipment. I parked the truck and started walking, looking for any signs of the girl. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a piece of clothing, a bag, anything that might help. I was about to give up when I saw it. A small, worn-out sneaker, partially hidden under some bushes. My heart skipped a beat. Crouched down, picking it up carefully. It was dirty, like it had been out here for a while. I looked around, suddenly feeling very alone. Then I saw him, a man, tall and lanky, standing on the ridge above me. He was watching me, his face unreadable. I raised my hand in a half-wave, trying to act casual, but my mind was racing. Something about him felt off. He didn't wave back. Instead, he turned and disappeared over the ridge. I quickly stuffed the sneaker into my jacket and made my way back to the truck. As I started the engine, my mind was buzzing. Who was that guy? What was he doing out here? And most importantly, was Emily still alive? I drove back to town, stopping at the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a grizzled old man named Harris, listened patiently as I told him about the sneaker and the man I'd seen. "You sure about this?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "Yeah, I'm sure. Look, I know it's not much, but maybe it's something." He sighed, taking the sneaker. "Me? All right, I'll send someone out to check it. In the meantime, you keep your eyes open and be careful, dude. This ain't the kind of place where people go missing." I nodded and left, feeling a mix of frustration and unease. I got back in my truck, ready to leave this place behind, but as I drove out of town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I handed over the sneaker and told them everything. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I could tell they thought I was just a paranoid trucker. I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I called Joe and told him what happened. He agreed it was best to lay low for a while, maybe change my route. I took his advice, steering clear of Sterling and its surrounding area. A few weeks passed, and things started to feel normal again. The memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the routine of the road. But then, out of the blue, I got a call from Sheriff Harris. "Duke, we found him. The guy you saw. He's dead." "What?" "Bang. Looks like he fell off a cliff near the quarry. We found his body yesterday. But here's the thing, he had more of Emily's stuff with him. We're still searching the area." A mix of relief and confusion washed over me. So he was the one? Seems like it, but we still don't know what happened to Emily. Just thought you should know. I thanked him and hung up, feeling a strange sense of closure. The man I'd seen was dead, but Emily was still missing. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was something. I kept driving, kept working, but the memory of that summer stayed with me. Every time I passed through a small town, I thought of Emily and her father, of the desperation in his eyes. I never saw Joe again. He retired a few years later and moved to Florida. We exchanged Christmas cards for a while, but eventually lost touch. Life went on, as it always does. But every now and then, when the road is long and the night is quiet, I think back to that hot summer day in Sterling. I think about the sneaker, man on the ridge, the girl who never came home. I wonder. My name is Duke Sullivan, and this happened to me in the summer of 1995. I was a truck driver, hauling freight across the Midwest, mostly small towns and back roads. It was a good job for a guy like me. Kept me on the move, no bosses breathing down my neck, and plenty of time to think. I was 35 back then, bit rough around the edges, but enjoying life. Little did I know that summer would change everything. I had just picked up a load in Elkhart, Indiana, and was headed to a small town in Missouri. It was a hot day, kind where sweat sticks to your back and the sun glares off the asphalt like it had a personal grudge. I remember stopping at a small diner just off Highway 50, grab a quick bite. There was nothing special about the place, just greasy food and bad coffee, but it did the trick. The waitress, a young woman named Jenny, was chatty. She asked me about my route, my truck, the usual small-town curiosity. She mentioned something about a missing girl from a nearby town and said her picture was on the news. I nodded, half listening, more focused on my burger. People go missing all the time, right? I didn't think much of it. After finishing up, I got back on the road, pushing through the afternoon heat. About an hour in, my CB radio crackled to life. It was another driver, Joe, who I'd run into a few times at various stops. Joe was one of those guys who always had a story, usually too good to be true, but he was good company on the long haul. "Hey Duke, you out there?" Joe's voice came through the static. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up, Joe?" I replied, adjusting the volume. "You hear about that girl, the one from Sterling? Word is they found her car, but not her. Weird stuff, man. Real weird." "Yeah, some waitress was talking about it," I said. "What do you think happened?" "Could be anything. Runaway, maybe. Something worse. You know how it is." I didn't say much more. Just listened to Joe ramble on about other missing person cases he'd heard of. By the time I rolled into Sterling, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows over the town. It was a quiet place. One of those towns where everyone knows everyone else and strangers stick out like a sore thumb. I pulled into a rest area just outside of town, figuring I'd catch a few hours of sleep before heading out early in the morning. The place was empty except for a couple of parked cars. I climbed into my sleeper cab, cracked the window to let in some air, and settled in for the night. I must have dozed off pretty quickly, because the next thing I knew there was a tapping on my window. Groggy, I rubbed my eyes and peered out. Standing there was a middle-aged man, scruffy, with a worn-out baseball. He looked desperate, his eyes darting around nervously. "Hey buddy, you got a minute?" he asked, twice shanky. I rolled down the window a bit more. "What's going on?" "My daughter, she's missing." "You a trucker? You see a girl, maybe 16, brown hair, blue eyes. Her name's Emily." "My name is Randall O'Alley, and this happened to me on October 17th, 2000. I remember the date, 'cause it was right around my birthday, and I was stuck on the road, driving my rig through the back roads of West Virginia. Being a truck driver ain't glamorous, but it pays the bills and gets me away from the city noise. I was heading towards a small town called Bramwell, carrying a load of auto parts. The plan was to drop off the goods and then hightail it back to Chicago for a long weekend. That was the plan. Anyway, I'd been driving for about 8 hours straight when I decided to pull over at a rest stop. It was one of those quiet places off Highway 52. Not much more than a couple of vending machines and a bath. I parked my truck and got out to stretch my leg. My back was killing me, and I needed a cigarette. As I lit up and leaned against the hood, I noticed an old, beat-up Ford parked at the edge of the lot. It wasn't uncommon to see cars in these spots. Something about this one, off. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life. A guy in a faded denim jacket came out of the bathroom. He looked rough. He hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had a sort of twitchy way about him. Glanced at me, then at the Ford, and quickly looked away. Climbed into his car, started the engine, and just sat there idling. I figured he was another trucker or a drifter. You see all kinds on the road. I finished my smoke and headed to the vending machine for a soda. As I was fumbling for change, I heard the rumble of an engine and looked up. The guy in the Ford was pulling out, not before he took one last long look at me. Wasn't friendly. Brushed it off and got back in my truck. The sun was setting, and I still had a couple of hours to go before I'd reach Bramwell. I turned on the radio, found a classic rock station, and hit the road. The highway was empty. It was a blessing and a curse. Made for easy driving, but it also made you feel isolated, like you were the only person left in the world. About an hour in, I noticed headlights in my side mirror. They were far back, closing in fast. Within minutes, the car was tailing me, way too close for comfort. I squinted at the mirror and recognized the Ford, the same beat-up piece of junk from the rest stop. What the hell does this guy want? I muttered to myself. I tried speeding up, but the Ford matched my pace. I slowed down, and he did the same. It was starting to freak me out. I honked my horn, hoping he'd get the message and back off. No dice. He just stayed there, like a shadow. I decided to pull over, hoping he'd pass me. I signaled and eased onto the shoulder. Instead of passing, he pulled over too, about 50 feet behind me. This was getting ridiculous. I grabbed my flashlight and got out, intending to have a word with this lunatic. I walked toward the car, and as I got closer, I could see the guy's silhouette behind the wheel. He was just sitting there, staring at me. Stopped about 10 feet away and yelled, "Hey man, what's your problem?" He didn't respond, didn't even flinch, just kept those creepy eyes on me. I felt a chill run down my spine but shook it off. I wasn't about to let some weirdo intimidate me. "Look, buddy, you've got something to say. Say it. Otherwise, get lost." Still nothing. Took a step closer, shining my flashlight into the car. That's when I saw it. Blood. There was blood smeared on the passenger seat and dashboard. My heart started pounding. This wasn't just some random nut job. Something bad had gone down in that car. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off it. When I was a safe distance, I turned and sprinted back to my truck. I locked the doors and grabbed my cell phone. No signal. I was in the middle of nowhere. I decided to make a run for it. I started the engine and floored it. A Ford's headlights flared up and he was right on my tail again. Panic set in. I needed to find help, and fast. Bramwell wasn't too far now. I could just make it there. The next 20 minutes were a blur of speed and fear. Ford stuck to me like glue, swerving erratically. I kept honking my horn, flashing my lights, hoping someone would notice. Finally, I saw the lights of Bramwell in the distance. I gunned it, my truck roaring as it pushed past the speed limit. I barreled into town, heading straight for the gas station I'd seen on my map. It was late. The place was still open. Pulled in hard, tires screeching, and jumped out, shouting for help. The attendant, a young guy named Cody, came running out. "What's going on?" he asked. "The guy's been following me for miles." Pointed down the road. Ford was gone, disappeared like a ghost. Cody looked skeptical but nodded. "Come inside. We'll call the sheriff." Inside, Cody dialed the local sheriff's office. I paced around trying to calm down. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting the Ford to come screeching into the lot. About 10 minutes later, Sheriff Tomlinson arrived. He was an older guy, grizzled but kind-looking. "Mr. Ali, Cody here says you've been having some trouble." I told him everything. The rest stopped to the blood in the car. He listened, nodding occasionally, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. "All right, let's take a look," said finally. We went back outside. Ford was still nowhere to be seen. The sheriff looked around, then back at me. "I'll have a patrol keep an eye out, but you might want to stay in town tonight just to be safe." Cody offered to let me park my truck behind the gas station and even gave me a cot in the back to crash on. I was too shaken to argue. I thanked him and tried to get some sleep, but every noise had me on edge. I kept thinking about those blood stains and the dead look in that guy's eyes. The next morning, I decided to head out early. The sun was just coming up as I climbed into my truck, hoping to put as many miles between me and Bramwell as possible. As I pulled onto the highway, I saw Sheriff Tomlinson parked at the edge of town. He waved, and I waved back. grateful for his help. I drove for hours, the road stretching endlessly before me. The events of the night before started to feel like a bad dream, something I could shake off. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, I saw it. Ford parked at the side of the road, the same guy leaning against it, watching me. My heart raced, and I felt a surge of anger. Enough was enough. I pulled over and grabbed my tire iron. I wasn't going to let this psycho mess with me anymore. As I marched toward him, he straightened up, faint smile playing on his lips. I stopped a few feet away, gripping the tire iron tight. "What do you want?" I demanded. He didn't answer, just stared at me with those dead eyes. I felt a surge of fear and swung the tire iron, but he dodged it easily, grabbing my arm and twisting it. Pain shot through me, and I dropped the iron. He shoved me to the ground and pulled out a knife. I scrambled back, kicking at him, but he was relentless. I managed to get to my feet and ran back to my truck, my arm throbbing. I jumped in and locked the door just as he reached me, slashing at the window with the knife. The glass held, but just barely. I fumbled for the ignition and started the truck, slamming it into gear. The tires squealed as I sped away, the guy still slashing at my window. I drove like a madman, heart pounding, until I couldn't see him anymore. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I pulled into a police station and told them everything. They took my statement and promised to investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I stayed in that town for a couple of days, too scared to get back on the road. When I finally did, I took a different route, avoiding West Virginia altogether. The memory of that guy, his dead eyes, and the blood in his car still haunts me. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing: I'm never taking the back roads again. Years later, I still think about that night. I still see his face in my nightmares. Some things you just can't shake. I kept on driving trucks, but I was always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if he was out there waiting. If you ever find yourself on Highway 52 near Bramwell, be careful. You never know who you might run into. My name is Leroy Cantrell. This all went down in July of 2009. I remember it clearly because it was a hot, sticky summer, and I was behind the wheel, my old Freightliner, hauling a load of steel beams to a construction site in southern Missouri. I'd been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, and you'd think I'd seen it all. But what happened that day still haunts me. I was rolling down Highway 60 somewhere between Poplar Bluff and Van Buren in the middle of nowhere. There's this stretch of road that cuts through the Mark Twain National Forest. Beautiful during the day, but desolate and eerie once the sun goes down. That evening, I was making good time, planning to stop at a truck stop near Springfield, grab a bite, catch some sleep. I had just crossed over the Black River when I noticed a beat-up old pickup on the side of the road with its hood up, and a guy waving frantically. Now, truckers have an unspoken code. You help each other out. I slowed down, pulled over, and hopped out to see what was up. The guy was maybe in his late 40s, scruffy beard, wearing a greasy baseball cap and a stained flannel shirt. He looked like he'd been working on that truck all day. "Hey man, need a hand?" called out, walking over. "Thank God you stopped," he said, looking relieved. "I'm Ray. Truck just up and died on me. Think it's the alternator. Any chance you could give me a ride to the nearest town?" I sized him up. He seemed harmless enough. I couldn't just leave him stranded. "Sure. Pop in," I said. "Nearest town's about 20 miles up the road." Ray grabbed a small duffel bag from his truck and climbed into the passenger seat. We got moving again, and he was a talker. He told me he was from Alabama, heading up to visit his sister in St. Louis. Said his truck had been giving him trouble for weeks, but he'd been hoping to make it just a bit further. We were maybe 15 minutes down the road when I noticed a car in my rearview mirror tailing us pretty close. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just someone impatient with my speed. But then it stayed right on us. Which was weird, given we were the only two vehicles on the road. "You know that car?" I asked Ray, nodding towards the mirror. He turned to look, and his face went pale. "Nah, no idea who that is," he said, but his voice wavered. "Maybe it's a cop?" "Joe," trying to lighten the mood. "You running from the law, Ray?" I asked. Forced a laugh. "No, nothing like that." I could tell something was off. I kept an eye on the car, which followed us for another 10 miles, never once trying to pass, just tailing us like a shark. When we hit a stretch where the forest thickened on either side, finally made its move. Car sped up, swerved around us and cut us off, forcing me to brake hard. "What the hell?" muttered. The car stopped dead in front of us, blocking the road. A tall, thin guy in a dark jacket got out and started walking towards us. He had a gun. "Stay calm, Ray," I said, my heart racing. I reached under my seat but remembered I'd left my pistol at home. Company policy had recently cracked down on drivers carrying weapons. I decided to play it safe. Guy reached my door and yanked it open. "Out of the truck," he ordered, pointing the gun at my face. I glanced at Ray, who looked terrified. "Look, we don't want any trouble," I said, raising my hand. "Take whatever you want." "Get out of the truck," he barked. We did as we were told, climbing down slowly. Ray stumbled, almost falling. Guy motioned us to the side of the road, keeping the gun trained on us. "Empty your pocket," he said. He handed over our wallets, phones, and keys. "You can take the truck, man," I said. "Just let us go." "Shut up," he snapped. He took our stuff and tossed it into the car, then walked back to us, his eyes darting nervously. "You," pointed at me, "get in the truck and start it." I glanced at Ray, who looked like he might pass out. "Don't try anything," Guy warned, dabbing the gun in my direction. I got back into the cab and turned the key. Engine roared to life. Guy motioned for Ray to get in the car. "You drive," ordered. With Ray in the car and me in the truck, I had no idea what his plan was, but wasn't about to argue with a gun. I started driving again, following the car as it led the way down the highway. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. The car led us down a narrow dirt road off the highway, way deeper into the forest. My mind raced with thoughts of escape. There was no way out. Trees closed in around us, and I knew we were heading into a trap. Finally, the car stopped in a small clearing. The guy got out, still holding the gun, and walked over to my door. "Turn it off," he said. I did. "Out," ordered again. Climbed down, my hands trembling. He motioned for me to follow him into the woods, where Ray was already being led by another man I hadn't noticed before. This one was shorter, stocky, a mean look in his eyes. "Move," first guy said, prodding me with the gun. We walked for a few minutes until we reached an old abandoned cabin. My gut twisted with fear. They pushed us inside, and I saw it was empty except for some old furniture and trash. "Sit," second guy said, shoving Ray onto a dirty couch. I sat next to him, trying to think of a way out. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The first guy smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a little insurance," said. "Make sure you don't go running to the cops." He turned to his partner. "Get the rope." Felt a cold sweat break out as the second guy rummaged through a bag and pulled out a length of rope. He tied us up, wrists and ankle, and left us on the couch. "Don't go anywhere," first guy said with a laugh, and they walked out, closing the door behind them. As soon as they were gone, I started struggling against the route. "We have to get out of here," I whispered to Ray, who was shaking uncontrollably. "They're going to kill us, aren't they?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not if we get out first," I said, trying to sound confident. I wriggled my wrists, trying to loosen the knots. It was slow, painful work, but I could feel the rope starting to give. We heard the car start up and drive away, leaving us in the eerie silence. "Come on, damn it," I muttered, finally getting one hand free. I quickly untied the rest and turned to help Ray. "Leroy, thank you," said, his voice cracking. "Save it for later," I said. "We need to move." We stumbled out of the cabin, looking around. The car was gone, and there was no sign of the two men. "Which way?" they asked, eyes wide with fear. "Follow the road," I said. "It's our best chance." We started walking, keeping to the edge of the road, ready to dive into the trees at the first sign of trouble. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the forest. I kept my ears open, listening for any sound of the car returning. After what felt like forever, we heard the faint sound of a vehicle approaching. "Hide!" I hissed, dragging Ray into the underbrush. We crouched down, holding our breath as the car drew closer. It wasn't the same car. This one was a beat-up old sedan, and the driver looked like an older man, probably a local. I stood up, waving my arm. "Hey, over here." The car slowed down and stopped. Driver rolled down his window, looking at us suspiciously. "What's going on here?" "Please, we need help," I said. "We were carjacked and kidnapped." "Can you call the police?" The man looked us over, then nodded. "Get in. I'll take you to the sheriff's office." We climbed into the back seat, exhausted and relieved. The man introduced himself as Earl, and he drove us to the nearest town, a small place called Allington. At the sheriff's office, we gave our statement, describing the two men and what had happened. The sheriff, grizzled old-timer named Frank, took our story serious. "We'll get a patrol out there to look for your truck and those men. You two are lucky to be alive." Ray and I exchanged a look. We were alive, but shaken to the core. The sheriff's deputies drove us back to the clearing where they found my truck, abandoned but otherwise untouched. There was no sign of the men or Ray's pickup. "Stay alert," the sheriff said as we prepared to leave. "These guys might come back." We thanked him and got back on the road, heading to the nearest truck stop. We needed to call our companies and report what had happened. But more than that, we needed to get some rest. As we drove away, couldn't help but think about how close we'd come to dying out. I'd always considered myself a tough guy. This experience had shaken me. Ray was quiet, staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. We parted ways at the truck stop, exchanging phone numbers and promises to stay in touch. I never saw him again, but I think about him every time I pass through southern Missouri. That night changed me. More cautious now, more aware of the dangers out on the road. I still help people when I can, but I'm always on guard, always ready for the unexpected. And every now and then, when I'm driving through the dark stretches of highway, I remember those two men and wonder if they ever got caught. They're still out there looking for their next victim. But I don't let it consume me. Life goes on, and so do I. After all, the road never stops calling, and there's always another load to haul, another destination to reach. As long as I'm behind the wheel, I'll keep moving forward, no matter what. That's the life of a trucker. Always moving, always watching, always surviving. My name is Clyde Baxter. This happened to me on November 12th, 1996. I was a truck driver hauling goods across the country, just trying to make a living. I'd been on the road for about 15 years by then, seen a lot of weird stuff. Nothing like what I'm about to tell you. I was driving through the back roads of southern Indiana, a route I wasn't too familiar with. The company had given me a last-minute job delivering a load of lumber to a small town I'd never heard of. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and I was running low on gas and patience. The radio had lost signal miles back, and the only company I had was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump, tires on asphalt. Pulled into a small, rundown gas station. Looked like it hadn't seen business in years. The sign was flickering, and the place had an eerie silence about it. But I was desperate. I parked the truck and walked over to the lone pump. An old man, probably in his 70s, came out from the station's office. His face was a road map of wrinkles, and he had a kind of vacant stare that made me uneasy. "Need some gas?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep it short. "Fill her up, please." He nodded and started pumping gas. Glanced around, noticing how deserted the place was. There were no other cars, no houses in sight, just dense woods surrounding the station. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. While he was filling up, I decided to stretch my legs and walked around the back of the station. That's when I saw it. A rusty old truck covered in dirt and grime, with its driver's door hanging open. Something about it seemed off. I stepped closer and saw dark stains on the seat and the steering wheel. Blood. I backed away quickly, my heart pounding. I thought about calling the cops, but my cell phone was dead, and the payphone by the office looked like it hadn't worked in years. I hurried back to my truck where the old man was finishing up. "How much do I owe you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. $20, he replied, still with that vacant stare. I handed him the money, jumped into my cab, and drove off as fast as I could without looking back. My mind was racing. What had I just seen? I needed to get out of there and report it to the authorities as soon as possible. About 10 miles down the road, I saw a woman standing by the side of the road, waving frantically. She looked terrified. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. She ran up to the truck, tears streaming down her face. "Please help me," she cried. "My boyfriend, he's hurt. We were attacked." I motioned for her to get in. She climbed into the passenger seat, trembling. Her clothes were torn and she had bruises all over her arms. "Where is he?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Back there in the woods," she said, pointing behind us. We were camping. Some guy came out of nowhere and attacked us. I managed to escape, but he's still back there. I nodded and turned the truck around, heading back towards the gas station. As we approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The old man was standing in the middle of the road, holding a shotgun. The same vacant stare, now with a sinister smile. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. The woman screamed, and I reached for the tire iron under my seat. The old man fired a shot, hitting the windshield but missing us. I threw the truck into reverse and floored it, backing away as fast as I could. "What do we do?" Woman sobbed. "We get to the nearest town and call the cops," I said, my hand shaking on the wheel. We drove for what felt like hours until we finally saw lights in the distance. It was a small diner, open 24 hours. I pulled in and we rushed inside, shouting for help. The staff and customers looked at us like we were crazy. They called the police. While we waited, the woman told me her name was Sarah. She and her boyfriend, Mike, had been on a road trip, camping in different spots along the way. They'd chosen a secluded area near the gas station for privacy, not knowing what was lurking nearby. The cops arrived about 20 minutes later. We told them everything, and they headed out to investigate. Sarah and I stayed at the diner, drinking coffee and trying to calm down. It was the longest night of my life. The next morning, the cops came back with grim news. They'd found Mike's body in the woods, not far from where Sarah had escaped. He'd been brutally beaten and left to die. They also found the old man's shack nearby, filled with disturbing evidence. Bloody clothes, weapons, and even some human remains. The old man himself was nowhere to be found. Police launched a manhunt, but as far as I know, they never caught him. Sarah was devastated, thanked me for saving her life. I stayed with her until her family arrived. Then I got back in my truck and drove away. The weight of the night's events heavy on my mind. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm driving alone on those dark, empty roads. It's a reminder that you never really know what's out there, lurking in the shadow. Every time I pass by a rundown gas station, I feel a shiver run down my spine, remembering the old man's vacant stare and sinister smile. Life went on. I never quite felt the same. I kept driving, but I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. The company offered me a different route, which I gladly accepted. I never went back to that part of Indiana. Years passed, and the memory of that night faded a bit, but it never completely disappeared. I'd hear about similar stories on the news, people going missing, strange attacks, and it always brought me back to that gas station and the old man with the shotgun. I stayed in touch with Sarah for a while. She moved out of state and tried to start over, but the trauma of losing Mike and the terror of that night haunted her. We'd exchange letters every now and then, but eventually we lost touch. I retired from truck driving a few years ago, but I still have nightmares sometimes. In them, I'm back at that gas station. The old man is there and I can't escape. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and it takes a while to calm down. I don't tell many people about what happened. Most wouldn't believe it anyway. But it's a story that needs to be told. A warning to others to always be cautious, to trust your instincts, and to be aware of the dangers that can hide in plain sight. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes the most ordinary situations can turn into your worst nightmare. I learned that the hard way, and even though I've moved on, part of me will always be that scared truck driver on a dark road in Indiana, trying to outrun a nightmare that felt all too real. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember to stay alert, trust your gut, and never let your guard down. You never know who or what you might encounter on those lonely, forgotten roads. My name is Duncan Morley. This happened to me on November 12, 1994. I was a truck driver making runs across the Midwest, hauling everything from fresh produce to construction material. This story starts on a route I'd taken dozens of times. That night, everything went sideways. I was on I-70, driving through Kansas. It was late, probably around 11 p.m. The radio played some classic rock, the kind that keeps you awake when the road seems endless. I had just picked up a load of steel beams from Topeka, heading towards Denver. The skies were clear, the kind of starry night that makes you feel small and alone on the open road. I remember stopping at a rest area near Junction City. I needed a break, cup of coffee, and maybe a quick nap before pushing on. The place was deserted, except for one old pickup. I didn't think much of it. Truckers and travelers come and go all night. I got my coffee from a vending machine that probably hadn't been cleaned in years and sat at a picnic table, letting the cool night air wake me up a bit. After about 20 minutes, I headed back to my rig. Was climbing up into the cab when I saw him, a man probably in his late 30s, standing by the edge of the lot. He was tall with a rugged look, kind of guy who could be a ranch hand, maybe an off-duty trucker. He had on a flannel shirt and jeans. Nothing unusual. There was something off about the way he just stood there, staring. "Need a lift?" I called out, thinking maybe he was stranded. "No thanks," replied, his voice flat. "Just enjoying the night." I nodded, climbed into my truck, and pulled out of the lot. As I merged back onto the highway, I saw him in the rearview mirror, still standing there, watching. I shrugged it off and focused on the road ahead. About an hour later, fatigue hit me harder than expected. I decided to pull over at another rest stop, this one even smaller and more isolated. I parked my truck and climbed into the sleeper cab to catch a few hours of sleep. The hum of the engine was my lullaby. I must have dozed off quickly, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a strange noise. It wasn't loud, just a subtle scratching sound. I sat up, listening. The noise was coming from the back of the trailer. Grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. my breath visible in the cold night air. The rest stop was eerily quiet. I walked around to the back of the trailer, shining my light. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just my truck and the empty parking lot. Then I noticed the lock on the trailer door was broken. My heart started pounding. I opened the door slowly, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness inside. Among the steel beams was a man. It was the same guy from the previous rest stop. He was sitting on one of the beams, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "What the hell are you doing in my truck?" demanded, my voice echoing in the trailer. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and started walking towards me. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. He moved with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I felt the urge to run, but my legs seemed glued to the spot. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I fell back, dropping the flashlight. We grappled in the dark, and I could feel his strength overpowering mine. I managed to get a hand free and punched him square in the jaw. He staggered back, giving me just enough time to scramble out of the trailer and slam the door shut. I ran to the cab, locking the doors behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone. I dialed 911, my breath coming in ragged gasps. 911, what's your emergency? There's a guy in my trailer, I panted. He attacked me. I'm at the rest stop off I-70 near mile marker 331. Stay on the line, sir. Help is on the way. I stayed in the cab, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror. Minutes felt like hours. I expected the man to come barreling out of the trailer any second, but he didn't. The silence was unnerving. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car. 2 officers approached, guns drawn. I unlocked the cab and stepped out, pointing to the trailer. "He's in there," I said, my voice shaking. The officers nodded and cautiously opened the trailer door. Their flashlights pierced the darkness inside. I held my breath, waiting for the struggle to ensue, but it didn't. Instead, the officers looked back at me, puzzled. "There's no one here," one of them said. "What? That's impossible." I shouted, running to the trailer, but it was empty. Just steel beams and shadows. "He must have escaped," other officers suggested, but there were no signs of forced entry or exit. They took my statement, and I described the man as best I could. They promised to patrol the area and advised me to stay alert. I thanked them, still shaken, and watched as they drove off into the night. Climbed back into my truck, every nerve on edge. Sleep was out of the question, so I decided to keep driving. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By morning, I was exhausted, decided to stop at a truck stop near the Colorado border. I parked among the other big rigs, the hustle and bustle of drivers giving me a sense of security. After grabbing a bite to eat, called my buddy Randy, who was also a trucker, and someone who'd understand the weirdness of the previous night. "Hey Duncan," he answered, his voice cheery. "How's the road treating you?" "You wouldn't believe the night I had," I replied, recounting the event. "Damn man," Randy said. "That's creepy. You should get a gun. Never know what kind of crazies are out there." "I know, but you know me. I've never been a gun guy. I might have to reconsider." We chatted for a bit longer before hanging up. I felt a bit better after talking to Randy. The unease lingered. I decided to take a nap in the truck stop's parking lot. Surrounded by the sounds of engines and chatter, I woke up in the late afternoon, feeling somewhat refreshed. I checked the trailer, finding everything as it should be. As I was about to climb back into the cab, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. I unfolded it and felt a chill run down my spine. "Next time you won't be so lucky." The note was handwritten, the letters jagged and uneven. My mind raced. How did he find me again? I looked around, but there was no sign of the man. I shoved the note in my pocket and started the truck, my heart pounding. I drove straight to Denver, stopping only when necessary. Each stop was filled with paranoia, my eyes scanning for any sign of the stranger. By the time I delivered the load and reached a motel for the night, I was a wreck. Locked the door, pushed a chair against it, and double-checked the windows. Only then did I let myself collapse on the bed. Sleep came fitfully, with dreams filled with faceless men and endless highways. The next morning, I called the police and reported the note. They took it seriously, assigning a detective to the case. Detective Harris met me at a diner in Denver, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s. "We're looking into it," she said after taking my statement. "We've had a few reports of strange incidents along I-70, but nothing concrete. We'll keep you posted." "Thanks," I said, though her words did little to comfort. For the next few weeks I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rest stop, every diner, every gas station, I was on high alert, but there were no more notes, no more sightings. Gradually, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though I was never quite the same. Months later, I heard from Detective Harris. They had found a man fitting the description in connection with another incident, but he'd vanished before they could apprehend him. The case went cold, and so did my trail of fear. I still drive those long hauls, but I'm more cautious now. I carry a knife and am considering Randy's advice about getting a gun. That night changed me. It's a reminder that no matter how familiar the road, danger can be just around the corner. Every time I pass that rest stop near Junction City, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there watching. My name is Orson Dio, and this happened to me on November 14th, 2003. I was working as a long-haul truck driver back then. My usual route took me across the Midwest, through the small towns and open fields of Indiana. I liked the solitude of the job, long hours on the road, and the simple pleasure of a hot cup of coffee at a roadside diner. One night, I was driving a load of auto parts from Detroit to St. Louis. The night was clear and cold, and I had the radio tuned to a classic rock station. Around midnight, I decided to take a break and pulled off at a truck stop just outside a little town called Crawfordville, grabbed a coffee and a sandwich, and chatted briefly with the waitress, a friendly woman named Beth. She told me about some local gossip and warned me to be careful because there had been a few strange disappearances in the area recently. I shrugged it off as small-town paranoia. I'd been through dozens of these places. Every one of them had some spooky tale to tell. After my break, I got back into the cab and hit the road again. The highway was empty. Just me and the hum of the engine. About an hour later, I noticed a set of headlights in my rearview mirror. They were far off at first, but slowly grew closer. I didn't think much of it until the car got right up behind me, tailgating me for a good few miles. It was odd because the road was empty, and there was plenty of space to pass. I slowed down, hoping they'd go around, but they just stayed there, close enough that I could make out the shape of the car. Dark sedan, maybe a Ford, Chevy. After a few more minutes, car finally pulled out, past. As it came up alongside me, I glanced over and saw a man behind the wheel, staring straight ahead. There was something off about him. His face was expressionless, almost robotic. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes on the road, passed me and sped off into the night. I shook it off as just another weirdo on the road, but about 20 minutes later, I saw those same headlights again. This time, the car was pulled over and the driver was outside, leaning against the hood. As I approached, he raised his hand, signaling for help. Against my better judgment, I decided to pull over. Truckers help each other out, and maybe this guy genuinely needed assistance. I stopped the truck and climbed out, leaving the engine running and the lights on. As I walked towards him, I noticed he was holding something. A wrench, maybe a tire iron. I called out, "Hey, you need some help?" He didn't respond, just stared at me with those cold, dead eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine but kept walking. When I was about 10 feet away, he suddenly lunged at me with the wrench. I jumped back, narrowly avoiding the blow. Without thinking, I turned and ran back to the truck. I could hear his footsteps pounding the pavement behind me. I reached the cab and slammed the door just as he reached the truck. He started banging on the door with the wrench, screaming something incoherent. I floored the gas pedal, and the truck lurched forward, leaving him behind in a cloud of exhaust. My heart was pounding as I sped down the highway, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of him. I drove non-stop until I reached a rest area about 50 miles down the road. I pulled in and parked, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I called the local sheriff's office and reported what had happened. The dispatcher took my information and promised to send a patrol car out to check the area. I didn't sleep much that night, but sat in the cab with a baseball bat I kept behind the seat, jumping at every little noise. By morning, I was exhausted, decided to keep moving. I delivered my load in St. Louis and tried to put the whole incident behind me. A few days later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. They had found the car abandoned on the side of the road. There was no sign of the driver. The car was reported stolen, and the guy who attacked me was still at large. They advised me to be cautious and to report any further encounters. Over the next few months, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped at a truck stop or rest area, I scanned the parking lot for that dark sedan. My nerves were shot, and I started carrying a pistol in the cab for protection. I didn't have a permit, but I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. Then, one night in late February, I was driving through the same stretch of Indiana when I saw those familiar headlights in my mirror. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just paranoia. The car stayed behind me for a few miles before pulling out to pass. I braced myself as it came alongside, but this time there was no one in the driver's seat. Car was empty, cruising along beside me as if it had a mind of its own. I stared in disbelief, and then the car swerved towards me, sideswiping the truck. Fought to keep control as the truck veered off the road, plowing into a ditch. Car kept going, disappearing into the night. I sat there, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I called the sheriff's office again and reported the incident. They sent out a tow truck and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do without any solid evidence. After that, I took a few weeks off to clear my head. I considered quitting the job altogether, but I loved the road too much to give it up. When I finally went back to work, I made sure to avoid that stretch of highway. A year passed without any incident. I started to think maybe it was all in my head, product of stress and exhaustion. Then one night in early December, I was driving through northern Kentucky when I saw a car broken down on the side of the road. I was about to pass by when I saw the driver, a young woman, waving frantically. Something about her seemed familiar, and as I got closer, I realized it was the same woman from the truck stop in Crawford. Beth. I pulled over and got out, calling out to her. Beth, what are you doing out here? She looked terrified, glancing around nervously. Orson, you've got to help me. Who's after you? I asked. She didn't answer, just grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the truck. Please, we have to go now. I helped her into the cab and got back behind the wheel, my heart racing as we drove. She told me a story that sent chills down my spine. The man who had attacked me was her ex-husband, a violent and unstable man who had been stalking her for years. She had moved to Crawfordsville to escape him. He had found her. She had been trying to get away. He was always one step ahead. As she spoke, I noticed a pair of headlights in the mirror. The same dark sedan was following us, closing in fast. Pushed the pedal to the floor, trying to outrun him. The car kept aiming. Beth screamed as the car rammed into the back of the truck, sending us swerving across the road. I fought to keep control, but the car hit us again, harder this time. Truck skidded off the road, crashing into a fence. I was dazed, managed to get out of the cab. Beth was unconscious, slumped over in her seat. I grabbed the pistol from under the seat and stepped out, ready to face him. The man stepped out of the car, a twisted smile on his face. He was holding a knife, blade glinting in the moonlight. I aimed the gun at him, my hands shaking. Stay back, I warned. I'll shoot. He didn't respond, just kept walking towards me. I fired a warning shot into the ground, but he didn't even flinch. As he got closer, I could see the madness in his eyes, wild, unhinged look that sent a chill down my spine. I fired again, this time aiming for his leg. The bullet hit its mark. He stumbled, falling to the ground. I ran back to the truck and tried to wake Beth, but she was still out cold. Called 911 and waited, keeping an eye on the man as he lay there, clutching his leg. The police arrived within minutes and took him into custody. Beth was taken to the hospital, and I was left to answer a barrage of questions. In the end, it turned out that Beth's ex-husband had been following me for months, using me to get to her. He was a dangerous man with a history of violence and had been responsible for the disappearances in Crawfordsville. Beth recovered, and we stayed in touch for a while. She eventually moved out of state, changing her name to start a new life. I continued driving, but was more cautious, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if he had any accomplices out. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it every time I drive through Indiana. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing as terrifying as those nights when I was being hunted by a madman. I learned to trust my instincts and never let my guard down, as you never know what's lurking out there on the open highway. My name is Victor Langston, and this happened to me on September 14th, 1994. I was a truck driver back then, running long hauls between Phoenix and Port. I loved the solitude of the open road, hum of the engine, and the feel of the asphalt under my wheels. But this particular trip is one I'll never forget, not because of the journey, but because of what happened at the rest stop near Twin Falls, Idaho. I'd been on the road for about 12 hours, and my eyes felt like sand. Coffee wasn't doing much anymore, so I decided to pull over for a quick nap. There's a rest area about 15 miles outside Twin Falls. Nothing more than a couple of vending machines and a restroom. But it's quiet and usually empty at night, perfect for a few hours of shut-eye. I parked my rig and climbed into the sleeper cab. I didn't even bother to set an alarm. I figured my body would wake me when it had enough, as it always did. I drifted off almost immediately, the sounds of the highway fading into the background. I woke up to a strange sound. It was subtle at first, almost like a whisper. It grew louder and more insistent. It took a moment to realize it was someone trying the door handle on my cab. My first thought was that it was another driver needing help, but the insistence of the rattling set off alarm bells. No one in their right mind would try to open a stranger's truck in the middle of the night. I reached under my pillow for the baseball bat I always kept. I didn't own a gun, never saw the need for one, but a solid piece of wood could do plenty of damage if necessary. I stayed still, listening. The rattling stopped, and I heard footsteps moving away from the cab. I peeked through the curtains and saw a shadowy figure heading toward the restroom. I couldn't make out any details, but something about the way they moved made my skin crawl. I debated whether to confront the person or just drive off. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of the truck, bat in hand, crept toward the restroom. The night was eerily silent, save for the distant hum of traffic. I reached the building and pressed my back against the wall, straining to hear any sound from inside. A soft thud, something heavy hitting the floor, reached my ears, then silent. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the bat, and stepped inside. The restroom was dimly lit, flickering fluorescent light, casting unsettling shadows. There were 3 stalls, all closed. I bent down to look for feet under the doors, but saw nothing. I pushed open the first stall door, empty. The second stall was the same. As I reached for the third door, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I spun around, bat raised, but there was no one there. Just the dimly lit room and the hum of the flickering light. I turned back to the third stall and pushed it open. It was empty too. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Long hours on the road can mess with your mind. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye in the mirror above the sink. A dark shape standing just outside the restroom door. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, but the doorway was empty. I was starting to think I was losing it. I backed out of the restroom, my eyes darting around the empty parking lot. There was no sign of the person who had tried my door. I hurried back to my truck, jumped in, and locked the door. My pulse was racing, but I told myself it was just some drifter, maybe looking for a place to sleep or something to steal. Still, I didn't feel safe. I decided to drive to the next town, where I knew there'd be a truck stop with other drivers around. Safety in numbers, and all that. Pulled out of the rest area, my eyes scanning the dark highway for any sign of movement. I was about 5 miles down the road when I saw headlights in my mirror. A car was following me, its beams too bright in the dark. I sped up, but the car matched my speed. My palms were slick on the steering wheel. I didn't want to believe it, but it felt like the driver was after me. I decided to test it. I slowed down to let the car pass, but it stayed behind me. Then I sped up again, and it did the same. My heart was pounding. This was no coincidence. Truck stop was still a few miles away, and I wasn't sure if I'd make it before the car tried something. Then I saw a turnoff for a small road leading into the hills. I didn't know where it went, but I figured a big rig like mine could handle it better than a car. I took the turn without signaling, my tires squealing on the asphalt. Car followed, but I could see its headlights bouncing in the rearview mirror as it struggled on the rougher road. I pushed my truck harder, navigating the twists and turns as best I could. After about 10 minutes, the headlights disappeared. I didn't slow down, though. I kept going until I saw a clearing where I could pull over, turn off my lights. I sat there in the dark, listening and waiting for the sound of an engine, but there was nothing. Just the night and the distant sound of cricket. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to start the engine again. I needed to get back to the highway, find that truck stop, and be around other people. I carefully made my way back to the main road, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of those headlights. When I finally pulled into the truck stop, felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders. I parked among the other rigs and headed inside to get a cup of coffee and calm my nerves. The place was brightly lit, hum of conversation and clatter of dishes, comforting contrast to the silence of the night outside. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the person at the rest stop and the car that followed me. Who were they? What did they want? Never got any answers. I knew I wasn't imagining things. The next day, I called my buddy Jack, another trucker who ran the same route. We'd been friends for years, and I knew I could trust him. I told him what happened, expecting him to laugh it off or say I was overreacting. But he didn't. "Vic," he said, his voice serious, "I've heard stories about that stretch of road. Drivers disappearing, strange people at rest stops. No one knows for sure what's going on, but you're not the first to have something like this happen." That sent a chill down my spine. Jack wasn't one to buy into ghost stories or urban legends. If he was taking it seriously, and I knew I wasn't crazy. I finished my delivery in Portland without any more incidents, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rest stop, every lonely stretch of road, I found myself looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to happen. A few weeks later, I was back in Twin Falls on another run. I decided to stop at the same rest area, partly out of curiosity, partly to see if I could get some closure. It was daytime this time, and there were a few other trucks parked there. I felt a bit safer. I walked to the restroom, my bat left behind in the cab, but my nerves on edge. Place looked the same, but it felt different in the daylight, less sinister, more mundane. I pushed open the third stall door again, half expecting to find something, but it was empty. As I was about to leave, an older trucker walked in. He nodded at me and went about his business. I hesitated, then decided to ask him if he'd seen anything strange around. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Son, I've been driving these roads for 30 years, seen all kinds of weird stuff. But if you're talking about the guy in the black sedan, you're not alone. Few drivers have mentioned being followed by someone like that. Cops don't do much about it, though. Just say it's someone messing around." That didn't make me feel any better, but at least I knew I wasn't the only one. I got back in my truck and headed out, my eyes still scanning the road, with a bit more resolve. I wasn't going to let some creep scare me off my route, but I made a point to avoid stopping at deserted rest areas, sticking to the busy truck stops where I knew I'd be safer. Years later, I retired from trucking. The open road lost its appeal after that night. Never found out who was behind the wheel of that car or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some punk playing a prank, or maybe it was something more sinister. But I'm grateful I trusted my instincts that night. It might have saved my life. Sometimes, when I tell this story to friends over a beer, they ask if I'd do anything different. I tell them no. I did what I had to do to stay safe. And if they're ever out on those lonely highways at night, they should do the same, because you never know who might be watching. Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, but before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? A couple of years ago, when I was 25, I shared an apartment with one of my best friends. Sadly, our friendship started fading as she wasn't around much. However, on this particular night, she decided to stay over and went to bed early. Due to my job schedule, I often stayed up late, and my routine usually involved watching YouTube videos and relaxing. On this night, everything seemed pretty normal until something strange happened. My neighbors actually tried to kidnap me. Let me share a bit more about where I lived and who my neighbors were. Our house had 3 bedrooms, and the 2 bedrooms along with the kitchen faced the neighbors, a young couple residing in a smaller mill house. They kept showing up at our door asking for weird stuff. I'm usually cool with helping neighbors, but these requests were kind of odd. For example, they wanted us to fill up an old Mountain Dew bottle with water because theirs had been turned off. They also asked for beer, and one time they literally asked us for just $1. It was getting a bit weird. When we didn't answer, I'd peek through the window to check. It was strange. Sometimes I'd catch them grabbing leftover cigarette butts from the ashtray or squishing their eyes against the door peephole, trying to see if we were home. So I'm sitting on the couch watching YouTube when I hear a knock at the door. I rolled my eyes because I knew exactly who was knocking. It was 11 p.m., and when I checked through the little door window, there he was, the boyfriend on my porch. Normally I'd just ignore it and go on with my night, but this time, he looked kind of troubled, so I decided to open the door and see what was up. Hey, I just wanted to ask if you could do me a favor. I've got a ring here in my pocket for my girlfriend, and I need someone to record the moment. Can you follow me to my backyard and film it for me? He nervously asked. It was unexpected. I was pretty confused, but really wanted to find out what was happening. I congratulated him and told him I'd join in a moment. I just needed to put on my shoes. Once I closed and locked the door, I rushed to the back room with a view of their backyard, peeking through the blinds. I expected to see some decorations or a setup, but it was totally dark. No signs of anything. It felt odd, so without wasting time, I woke up my roommate to share the whole story with her. "No way," she told me, and we both walked back to the door. After the boyfriend started banging on it, I peeked through the little door window again. It was pretty dark outside, and I couldn't see much. Then I saw him move his eye away from the peephole. It gave me a chill, and I quickly turned around, pressing my back against the door. My roommate hurried back to the door from her room, grabbing 2 wire hangers like they were shields. We both clung to the hangers and sat against the door until he finally left. It was pretty scary, but we wanted to be sure we weren't overreacting. So we decided to go out through the back door and hopped into her car for a quick drive around the neighborhood. They always kept their front door wide open, and there were no blinds, so you could easily see inside their house. We drove by slowly in her car. Inside the living room on the couch, the couple and an older man were all just sitting there, staring at the wall. We quickly drove away and decided to stay at a friend's house that night. After that, I stopped answering the door for them. But one day, when I came home from work, I noticed an older lady parked in their driveway. As I got out of my car, she walked up to me and asked if I knew where the neighbors were. I explained that I hadn't seen them in quite a while. Then I asked her who she was, and she informed me that she was the owner of the house. She told me they hadn't paid rent for months, which led to her having to evict them. When she went inside the house, it was a disaster. Needles scattered, garbage all over, walls with holes, and even a mess on the floor. I expressed my sympathy for what she had to deal with, and mentioned that I was glad they were finally out. But thinking about the condition of their house, I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't followed him to the backyard. Who knows what he might have had planned that night? When I was 19 years old, I had a job in a small mall in my quiet town. Not many serious crimes happen there, and it's a peaceful place. However, The city that's about 15 minutes away used to have one of the highest murder rates in Canada. The mall where I worked wasn't too big. It was a common spot for moms with their kids and older people looking to pass the time. It's a really safe mall, not sketchy at all. One day, during my break, I headed to the food court to grab a drink and scroll through my phone, just like I always did. As I sat there, I noticed two women walking towards me. My first guess was that they saw my work uniform and might have questions about something my store sells. I didn't think anything bad was happening. They walked up to me and quickly sat down at my table in the food court. Both of them spoke with strong accents, though I wasn't sure what kind, as I hadn't heard it before. They were dressed really fancy, like they were going to church or a special event, and seemed pretty regular, nothing strange about them. Then one of the women took out a book, and they started asking me some strange questions. Like, do you go to church, and do you believe in God? Mostly they asked things about religion. I thought they might be some kind of missionaries. They started telling me about God the Mother. Since I'm really shy, I just listened to them talk. Then they invited me to a youth group they organized for that evening. I was a bit surprised, not expecting such an invitation during my break at the mall. I told them I was at work, just taking a break, so going with them wasn't possible. But they kept insisting, and I had to repeat a few times that I couldn't join. Finally, they got the message. But then they asked for my phone number, saying they'd text me the details the next time they organized something. I felt a bit uneasy, but gave them my number to end the conversation. A couple of days later, I got a text from them trying to plan something for the youth group. I felt a bit trapped because I wasn't really interested, but I didn't want to be rude. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about whether to reply or not. Eventually, I decided to block the number. It wasn't that I thought they were going to do something bad. I just wasn't into the idea of going to a youth group. I hoped blocking the number would make it clear that I wasn't interested without having to explain. A few months later, I was reading the news, and there was a story about a warning for young girls in our city regarding a human trafficking scheme. The report mentioned a tactic where women would approach people and talk about God the Mother, trying to convince them to leave with them. I felt a rush of relief, realizing that I hadn't finished my shift that day. When those women approached me, I wondered what might have happened. Moreover, I was thankful that I never responded to their text. It's strange to think about how a small decision like that might have kept me safe. When I spent the night at my friend's house in middle school, we liked staying up late. The only tricky part was that the bathroom was near his parents' room, and we didn't want to get in trouble for waking them up, especially during those late-night nature calls. To avoid any problems, we came up with a plan. Instead of using the bathroom, we quietly shut the basement door and went into the woods to take care of business. The door was almost always open because we sometimes forgot our keys and got locked out. It happened a lot since we often went out to do things in the woods. On this particular night, my friend's older brother was around, and he kept barging in through the basement door, making the situation even more chaotic. So we came up with another plan to stop him from constantly barging in. We decided to lock the door, even though we knew it wouldn't really keep him out. The idea was that he'd have to use the key, and maybe that would take away some of the fun for him. But around midnight, we heard the door handle jiggling. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just his brother messing around. Then, after about 5 minutes of the handle being jiggled on and off, we got a bit frustrated. That's when we decided to take action. We went up to the door, hit it, and shouted at him to stop. However, all we got in response was silence. We thought that was a good thing and hoped it was all over. But about 10 minutes later, the jiggling started again. This kept happening, repeating for about 2 hours. No matter how many times we told him to stop, he didn't listen. Eventually, we got frustrated and just said, "Forget it," deciding to ignore him. Even after we stopped paying attention, he kept going for about half an hour more. It felt like forever, but finally, he gave up. Let's jump ahead to around 9 in the morning. We were just waking up, and one of my friends needed to use the bathroom. You know how it is at sleepovers. People are sleeping wherever there's space, and when one person starts moving around, it wakes everyone up. We all started stretching and heading to the bathroom to get rid of the soda we drank the night before. As I walked out, I grabbed the door handle to close it behind me and noticed it felt weird, like it had a rough texture. When I checked it, I saw that the area around the keyhole was messed up. There were big scratch marks everywhere, and the metal parts were all bent and crooked. I asked my friend who lived there what had happened, and he said it was the first time he noticed it. We didn't want to get blamed for what his brother did, so we went upstairs and explained everything to his parents. When his dad went downstairs to see what we were talking about, his face went pale, and he hurried back upstairs to call the police. It turned out that someone had been trying to force the lock open while we were all in the house. It was pretty scary to think that someone had been trying to get in while we were sleeping. This had happened to me more than once on different occasions, but what really scared me this time was that the person knew we were in the house, and we knew someone was trying to break in. But they still kept trying to force their way inside. It was pretty disturbing. I have no idea what kind of person he was or what he had in mind for us that night. I live on the 6th floor with my family, and we've been here for a long time. The apartment next to ours is owned by a not-so-nice lady who rents it out. But the problem is, she seems to rent it to people who cause a lot of trouble. I'm talking about serious problems like drug dealers and domestic violence. This happened a few years ago when I was around 14 or 15 years old. I'm a female, and English isn't my first language, so forgive any grammar mistakes. A couple, probably 35 to 40 years old, had just moved in with their young daughter, who looked about 6 years old. The wife introduced herself, and she seemed nice at first. They mostly kept to themselves, and that was okay with us. But a few weeks after they moved in, things got tricky. They played really loud music during the day and night. It wasn't against the rules, but it bothered us when it went on for hours every day. Then we could hear shouting from their apartment, but it always seemed to be the husband doing the yelling. They started leaving their apartment door open, and when we walked by to use the elevator, they would be walking around in their underwear. It was strange, but we thought maybe it was because it was summer and hot. It became more bothersome when we had guests, as they had to walk past a nearly naked man just hanging out by our door, smoking. Smoking was just another issue. I don't mind weed, as I've also tried it a few times myself, but when they smoked, a lot of smoke would come into our apartment. It was so much that you could see it everywhere. My mom was really bothered because we had a little kid in our apartment, my brother, who was about 4 years old. We didn't want him breathing in smoke every day, but we decided to just deal with it and hope they would move out eventually, like the other people who lived there before. Usually, no one stayed for more than a year. One day, I was coming home after walking with my dogs. We have 2 dogs, a medium-sized one and a small one, both rescued. I unlocked my apartment door, and the dogs went inside. Just as I was about to follow, I heard a hey behind me. I turned around and got scared when I saw who it was. It was the husband. For more information, we hadn't talked before this. He was very close to me, like just inches away from my face, and he was only in his underwear. He was taller than me by a lot, so I felt uncomfortable. I asked if he needed something, and then he quickly looked around, as if checking for other people in the small hallway we shared. After that, he came even closer, and I could feel his breath on my face. It smelled like weed, and I tried not to gag so I wouldn't be rude. At that time, I always tried to be nice to everyone, even in risky situations like this. Then in a rough voice he whispered, "What do you want?" I was confused. I thought I heard wrong, so I asked him to say it again. "What do you want? Drugs? Alcohol?" My eyes got really big. I was taught not to drink or do drugs, and even if that wasn't the case, I was clearly underage. So, I didn't understand why he was offering these things to me. No thank you, mister," I said. I had hoped that by being polite, this interaction would be over and I could go inside. If you're wondering why I didn't just go inside sooner, like I said, I was a major people pleaser, and I didn't want to offend him. But also, I didn't know how he would react. I didn't want to risk him chasing me inside or assaulting me. If he was unstable enough to corner a teenage girl in his underwear and offer her illegal substances, I didn't want to imagine what would happen if I pissed him off. "Al, come on, you must want something. I can hook you up with whatever," he said, giving me a wide grin and somehow stepping even closer. I moved my back against the door, realizing I couldn't make more space between us. Then I let out a nervous laugh. "No thanks, my mom wouldn't like me having that," I said. He tilted his head, still smiling. "Well, is she home now?" Silly me, I said no. She was at work. "Oh, well then, she doesn't need to know. Just tell me what you want." I started breathing really fast. I've had problems with men being mean to me before, so a man standing over me and trapping me made me really anxious. I felt like I might throw up, and I could feel myself starting to shake. I just hoped he wouldn't notice. "No thanks," I said again. I have to go. I have homework to do." I was trying to smile so he wouldn't know I was scared. but my shaking got worse. He seemed annoyed, but nodded and said to have a nice day. I hurried inside and quietly locked the door. I was breathing hard, and I peeked through the small hole in the door, but he was still there, just staring at my door. He looked like he was out of it, and I hoped he would leave. He stood there for about 30 more seconds, then suddenly turned around and ran into his apartment. I heard him going through cabinets, and in my mind, I thought he might be looking for something to break into my house. Now I was getting really scared. I grabbed my phone, called my dogs, and rushed to the kitchen to get the biggest knife I could find. I sat on the floor and stared at the door while calling my mom. I was almost crying when she answered, and she told me to call the cops if I thought I was in danger. But for some reason, I said no. Maybe I thought I didn't want to bother the police for something that might not be a big deal. My mom couldn't leave work early, but she called the cops as soon as she got home. Meanwhile, his wife had come back home a few minutes later. She knocked on our door. My mom answered while I stayed behind her. She asked my mom lots of questions about what I told her and what happened. When my mom explained and said the police were called, the wife nervously laughed and said, "It wasn't needed. My husband didn't mean any harm. He was just trying to sell you some CDs he makes, as he really likes music." What? He kept asking me if I wanted alcohol multiple times. How did she start talking about selling CDs? But my mom didn't buy it, and she knows what really happened. She trusts me. The woman's smile turned into an angry face, and she went back into the apartment. We heard her lock the doors, close all the curtains, and turn off the lights. The police arrived shortly after, and came inside to hear what happened. Then they went to their door and knocked, but nobody answered. We told them we saw everyone go inside and lock themselves in, but they couldn't do anything about it because they didn't have a special permission, and no one physically hurt me. They said the man would get a warning, but only when they could reach him. The police left, and we didn't hear anything else from the neighbors all day. We went to bed later. I had trouble falling asleep, but eventually managed to. During the night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a woman screaming. It was loud and really upsetting, and I thought someone might be in trouble. I heard my mom going to the closest window, and then she came to my room and said to stay in bed. I wanted to ask her more about what was happening, but I trusted my mom, so I stayed in bed like she told me. I eventually fell asleep again. When I woke up, my mom sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that the man from yesterday had jumped out of the window during the night. Since we were on the 6th floor, he probably died when he hit the ground. The screaming we heard was from his wife, watching him climb out of the window and jump, unable to stop him. I felt really bad. I almost started crying, and it made me think that somehow it was my fault. After that incident, my mom felt bad for leaving me home alone to go to work, but she couldn't do much about it because we didn't have a lot of money. I was at home with my little brother because he was sick, and I wasn't going to school because I was too upset. Well, a few days later, when my mom left for work, there was a knock at the door. I looked through the peephole and saw it was the guy's wife. She was smoking a cigarette. Her eyes were red, and she looked really upset. She was walking around and talking to herself. I told my little brother to go into his room and went to open the door. When I did, and the wife saw me, she started to get really angry and pointed her cigarette near my face. "How dare you? Why did you call the police on my husband? Why? He didn't do anything to you. He just wanted to sell you some CDs, and you reported us. Are you scared of men or something? Are you scared of men in underwear? Is that it?" I couldn't believe what she was saying. If it were me today, I would have told her to go away and shut the door right in her face. But at that time, I was young, not very smart, and too trusting. So what did I do instead? I said, "Sorry." I told her I was sorry about her husband and that I really hoped she could forgive me. "You little piece of whore. You killed my husband. It's all your fault, and I wish that you, your mom, and brother all get sick and die." I looked down at the ground without saying anything, still sure it was my fault. She kept saying mean things, but eventually she left. I went back inside, locked the doors, and cried. I cried for about half an hour, and my little brother kept asking what was wrong, but I didn't tell him. I've been talking to someone about my feelings and taking medicine for the past year or two. I can say I'm in a better place now. The incident with Happy. This happened about 4 years ago. I'm 21 now and no longer live in that neighborhood, but yesterday when I visited my parents, I saw my old neighbor and it reminded me of what happened. Here's some background. I live in a third world country, and our neighborhood is considered one of the worst, at least by outsiders. Despite this, we are quite friendly with each other, even with those who have been in jail. Our community includes many people with mental health challenges, and one of them is a man my mother and I call Happy, because his name literally means that. We used to joke, "Oh, Happy, are you happy?" because he often had a smile on his face, unless someone upset him, which happened about 3 times a year. I stayed in that neighborhood for about 19 years, so I knew him well. He lived with his 2 brothers. One sold fruit, and the other drove a taxi. Happy didn't have a job due to a mental illness, which I think might be a form of schizophrenia, though I'm not sure. His condition made it difficult for him to function like others. Conversations with him were hard because his sentences didn't make much sense, and he couldn't talk about normal topics like sports or news. Sadly, mental illness is not taken seriously in my country. We only have 3 facilities for people with mental health issues, so there's no way for him to get proper treatment. Most people just called him crazy, which is really sad. My dad used to be friends with Happy and his brothers, but they eventually drifted apart. Dad would give Happy some money to buy cigarettes, and knew that the brother who drove the taxi had 2 kids to support in another city, while the fruit-selling brother didn't make much. Happy sometimes helped carry groceries, and my dad would give him some money for that. So, growing up, I knew Happy as a helpful, friendly person. I always smiled at him, and he would smile back at me. But when I turned 15, Happy changed a lot. He still had a smile, but he would stand in shady spots all day, smoking. He was always there, from early morning to late at night, and it seemed like he barely slept. He started staring at me with a creepy, forced smile whenever I passed by. Sometimes he would walk backward while staring at me, or press his back against walls as if he were hiding. His whole demeanor shifted, and he started getting angry more often, yelling things that didn't make sense and stomping angrily back to his house. Now, let me tell you what really happened. When I was 17, I stayed home one day to study while my family went out. Happy must have noticed that I was alone, as I saw him standing in his usual spot, staring as they drove away. Around lunchtime, I went to buy some groceries. Happy was standing near his brother, who was selling fruit at the local market. I bought my vegetables and meat, and as I walked home, I noticed that Happy was right behind me. I didn't think much of it since our houses were next to each other, but when I passed his house, his footsteps didn't stop. I turned around and saw him still staring at me with that unsettling smile. A couple of years ago, when I was 25, I shared an apartment with one of my best friends. Sadly, our friendship started fading as she wasn't around much. However, on this particular night, she decided to stay over and went to bed early. Due to my job schedule, I often stayed up late, and my routine usually involved watching YouTube videos and relaxing. On this night, everything seemed pretty normal until something strange happened. My neighbors actually tried to kidnap me. Let me share a bit more about where I lived and who my neighbors were. Our house had 3 bedrooms, and the 2 bedrooms along with the kitchen faced the neighbors, a young couple residing in a smaller mill house. They kept showing up at our door asking for weird stuff. I'm usually cool with helping neighbors, but these requests were kind of odd. For example, they wanted us to fill up an old Mountain Dew bottle with water because theirs had been turned off. They also asked for beer, and one time they literally asked us for just $1. It was getting a bit weird. When we didn't answer, I'd peek through the window to check. It was strange. Sometimes I'd catch them grabbing leftover cigarette butts from the ashtray or squishing their eyes against the door peephole, trying to see if we were home. So I'm sitting on the couch watching YouTube when I hear a knock at the door. I rolled my eyes because I knew exactly who was knocking. It was 11 p.m., and when I checked through the little door window, there he was, the boyfriend on my porch. Normally I'd just ignore it and go on with my night, but this time, he looked kind of troubled, so I decided to open the door and see what was up. Hey, I just wanted to ask if you could do me a favor. I've got a ring here in my pocket for my girlfriend, and I need someone to record the moment. Can you follow me to my backyard and film it for me? He nervously asked. It was unexpected. I was pretty confused, but really wanted to find out what was happening. I congratulated him and told him I'd join in a moment. I just needed to put on my shoes. Once I closed and locked the door, I rushed to the back room with a view of their backyard, peeking through the blinds. I expected to see some decorations or a setup, but it was totally dark. No signs of anything. It felt odd, so without wasting time, I woke up my roommate to share the whole story with her. No way, she told me, and we both walked back to the door. After the boyfriend started banging on it, I peeked through the little door window again. It was pretty dark outside, and I couldn't see much. Then I saw him move his eye away from the peephole. It gave me a chill, and I quickly turned around, pressing my back against the door. My roommate hurried back to the door from her room, grabbing 2 wire hangers like they were shields. We both clung to the hangers and sat against the door until he finally left. Someone had added me as a friend from an account called "Why Didn't You Enter the Basement?" It was Chester. I blocked the account immediately. A few minutes later, another request came in, this time from an account named "Why'd You Block Me?" I blocked that one too, but then another appeared. "I know where you live." A moment later, another request. "I'm right outside your house." Then I heard a window shatter downstairs. I called the cops and explained what was happening. The operator told me to find a safe place to hide, so I hung up and locked myself in a closet. As I sat there, I heard footsteps moving from downstairs to upstairs. Peeking through a crack in the closet door, I saw Chester at the end of the hallway. He didn't seem to notice me at first, but then he turned his head, looking right at the closet. I didn't close the door completely, so I moved deeper into the shadows. Chester walked over and opened the closet door. I was hiding behind a large container, and as he fumbled to find the light switch, he eventually gave up and went back downstairs. Seconds later, the police knocked on the door. I opened it immediately and told them what had happened, but by the time they arrived, Chester was gone. They found a broken window in my basement, which is how he had escaped. The next day at school, I reported Chester to the principal. The creepiest part? The principal told me that no student named Chester had ever been enrolled at our school. There were no records of him whatsoever. They checked the security cameras and found that he had snuck in through a back entrance and blended in with the students. I never saw him again, and I never heard back from the police. To this day, I still wonder what Chester's intentions were and why he wanted me to go into the basement. Looking back, he was probably the most dangerous person I've ever encountered. When I was 15, in my sophomore year of high school, lunch periods were randomly assigned. That year, I only had my friends Liam and Mike in my lunch period. A few months into the school year, a new kid joined us in first period astronomy. Our teacher, who loved to joke around, made him introduce himself to the class. His name was Craig. The teacher teased Craig for a bit before telling him to take a seat. I was in the back row, and the only available desk was next to me. Craig sat down, and since class hadn't started yet, everyone was still chatting. As he settled in, Craig looked around the room, then our eyes met. He nodded and said, "What's up?" I replied, "Hey man, what's up?" He introduced himself, so I told him my name. Craig was a white kid with patchy facial hair that looked like it hadn't fully grown in. He wasn't unattractive, but he was just average looking. He tried to make small talk, and I was friendly, understanding how tough the first day at a new school can be. I was probably the first person he officially met there. During the period, we had to pair up for an assignment, and Craig asked to work with me. I agreed, since I didn't have any close friends in that class anyway. We used laptops for the assignment, and it quickly became apparent that Craig's sense of humor was not to my taste. He joked excessively, acting as if we were close friends, but his jokes were offbeat, and his laugh was cringeworthy. He swore frequently and made constant dirty jokes. I'm not easily offended, but his behavior was overwhelming. At the end of the period, we exchanged numbers for the project, and then I moved on to my next class. When lunch arrived, Mike wasn't at school that day, so it was just Liam and me at our circular lunch table. Suddenly, Liam's gaze shifted to someone behind me. I turned to see Craig pulling up a chair next to me. He patted my shoulder and said, "What's up, buddy?" I felt a pang of dread. It meant Craig would be joining us for lunch every day. I tried to stay positive, hoping he might not be that bad. Liam initially tried to be friendly, but Craig's odd behavior soon became apparent. Liam noticed something was off and gave me knowing glances when Craig wasn't looking. That lunch period confirmed that something was wrong with Craig. I'm not judging anyone for being antisocial, but Craig seemed to have a dark side. His comments went beyond just being antisocial. They were unsettling. After school, since it was a Friday, I walked home and texted my friends about our plans later. On my walk, I received a text from an unknown number. It was Craig. He said, "Turn around." I did, and saw Craig running toward me, waving. I muttered, "Oh God," under my breath. When he caught up, he asked how far I lived from school. I said about a 10-minute walk, and he mentioned he lived the same distance. He offered to walk with me, and suggested we finish the assignment over beers. I told him I was busy with friends. He then asked what we'd be doing, trying to invite himself. I said we'd be hanging out at Liam's house, and he asked if he could join. I made up an excuse about Liam's mom not allowing strangers in, and it seemed to work. Craig kept walking with me, and I began to wonder if he was following me home. He did follow me. When I reached my house, I told him, "All right, see you later," and gave him a fist bump. He said goodbye and continued down the street. I noticed him glance back, so I looked away. I texted my group chat about how strange Craig was, and Liam agreed. We made plans to hang out at Liam's house later, but not until around 9 o'clock. A couple of hours later, Craig sent me a disturbing text. "Yo, what's going on in front of your house? Why is there a cop car?" I went outside to check, but there were no cop cars, just Craig standing in our driveway. He laughed and said, "I got you." He then asked why I was going to Liam's house later. I said, "Yeah, in a bit," and asked why he was acting so strange. He didn't laugh. I could see he was offended. I told him I had to go inside and shut the door. Craig texted me, "Bro, WTF?" I was speechless. I had just met this kid that day, spent 40 minutes with him, and now he was obsessing over me and stalking me. He had tricked me into coming outside to see if I was home. I texted back, "You're freaking me out, bro." That was a mistake. Craig sent me a long message saying he thought I was different from others, but I was just like everyone else. I shared the message with my friends, and they were both shocked and amused. I emailed my teacher to explain the situation and ask if I could do the assignment on my own. I left my house and walked to Liam's, needing to get out. While I was there, Craig tried calling me, but I ignored it. I knew Monday would be an awkward day in class. When I got home later that night, around 11 or 12, my parents and sister were out. My parents were probably with friends, and my sister might have been with her boyfriend. Nothing unusual. I locked the door behind me and went to my room. I started watching YouTube videos when I heard the back doorbell ring. Yes, our house has a back doorbell with a different tone than the front one. I went downstairs, expecting it to be my sister, but the backyard lights were off, and no one was visible through the glass. I opened the main door, leaving the screen door locked, and called out, but I heard the sound of someone's shoe scraping the concrete patio just to the left of the door. I shut the door again, locked it, and went back upstairs to call my dad, who didn't answer. Just then, my phone rang. It was Craig. I didn't pick up. He then texted, "Come outside." I replied, "I'm calling the police." To my surprise, he texted back, Okay, I'm leaving." It was him hiding in the yard, waiting for me to come out. I took a screenshot of the text and sent it to my family, friends, and the school. The school contacted his parents, who revealed that this was a common issue with Craig. He had been causing problems at every school he attended. I can only imagine the terrible things he did to others who didn't want to be his friend. Craig didn't show up to class on Monday, or ever again. I suspect he transferred schools once more. I was a senior when this happened. By then, senioritis had fully set in, and it was football season. Our high school was big on football because our team was actually good, and there was nothing else to do in our small, rural town. One day at school, we were in a silly, elective class. My friend JJ was in the class with me, so we were always goofing around. It was a Friday, and we had plans to attend the football game later. JJ, being the smooth talker he is, turned his chair around to face Kayla and Ashley and invited them to the game. We knew them well, so it wasn't weird for him to ask. They seemed up for it, so JJ dropped me off at home after school. About 4 hours later, he picked me up, and we went to get Kayla and Ashley before heading to the school's back parking lot by the woods. We had some Four Locos with us, making sure nobody was watching as we poured them into water bottles to bring to the bleachers. We secured good seats at the top row of the bleachers. Since the game started late, it was dark by the third quarter and pitch black by the fourth. Our team was losing badly, and many kids were leaving early. We decided to stay and hang out on the field after the game. When it ended, the field and bleachers were quiet. The crowd was dispersing. The team had retreated to the locker room in embarrassment, and the visiting team was heading to their buses. Within 10 minutes, we were among the few left in the bleachers, with just a couple of other people around and a few on the field. We were quite drunk by then, and the team's defeat wasn't affecting our fun. When the field lights went out, it was almost completely dark, illuminated only by moonlight. We went to lie down on the field. JJ ran to his car to get more alcohol. It was probably around 10 o'clock by now. JJ suggested going into the woods next to the football field. The girls were scared, which made the idea more appealing. When they refused to budge, JJ and I ran towards the woods, knowing they would follow us. We crawled under a small gap in the fence that kids used to get into the woods and walked down the hill. The girls were hesitant, but followed. We decided to hide to scare them. As soon as they heard us running, they panicked and tried to catch up, but we lost them and hid behind some trees. We laughed for a bit, then JJ nudged me and pointed. In the dark, we could barely make out a towering black figure, maybe 15 feet away, standing between two trees. It was terrifying. Then the figure spoke in a woman's voice, saying, "You kids shouldn't be in here." We stood frozen in silence as the figure seemed to grow larger and closer, though we didn't see any legs moving. There were no footsteps. JJ and I turned and ran, calling for the girls until we found them. We told them to head to the car quickly, and we explained that there was a 7-foot-tall woman in the woods. JJ said if I hadn't seen it too, he'd have thought he'd seen a ghost. The girls were freaked out and wanted us to say we were joking, but we weren't. We watched from the car to see if anyone came out of the woods, but no one did. We wondered why an older woman would be in there at night alone, especially since it wasn't a nature trail, but a fenced-off wooded area. Our school didn't have security back then, so it wasn't too surprising. The four of us went to JJ's house afterward, and I'll leave the rest of that night to your imagination. Fast forward to the summer, when I was working at the school as a custodian. I returned every summer for a raise. There were about 4 of us working in the building, 2 older custodians, another 18-year-old, and me. While mowing the grass in the school's center courtyard, I spotted someone at an upstairs window. It was an older woman, around 65, with short curly hair. Her face was blurred behind the window's glare. I stopped mowing, looked at her, and waved, but she didn't move or wave back. I rushed inside to find my boss and asked him about the woman upstairs. He followed me to the math hallway, where I had seen her, but all the classroom doors were closed and the lights were off. The classroom she was supposed to be in was empty. My boss told me there was no one else in the building and suggested I drink some coffee. He went back downstairs, and I followed. I was genuinely spooked. After finishing mowing, I started mopping the upstairs hallways and classrooms. In the math hallway, I opened all the doors and turned on the lights. With my radio playing music, I distinctly heard a woman's voice say, "Young man?" I couldn't tell which classroom it came from, so I turned off the music and checked every room, hoping to find someone. All the classrooms were empty. I even checked behind the desks. My arms were tingling, and I felt a fight or flight response kick in. I rushed downstairs and told my boss that I heard a voice and saw someone up there. He came up with me again, but we found no one. He told me to go home, take the day off, and get some rest. He thought I was imagining things. I connected the two incidents and wondered if they were related. What if the figure JJ and I saw in the woods and the voice I heard in the classroom were somehow connected? When I returned to work, I told my boss I didn't want to work in the math hallway because I was scared. For the rest of the summer, I avoided that hallway altogether. Since then, I've firmly believed that my old high school is haunted by the spirit of an older woman. I have no other explanation for these experiences. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, but before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? About 8-ish years ago, I lived in a town in the mountains that had a lot of vacant and abandoned houses. I had gone into 2 of them. The first one I went into honestly scared me. It was off a stone road with a few other houses scattered down the road. My boyfriend at the time and I drove there, even though it was less than a mile from where we lived. It had snowed a lot, and there was probably a good 8 inches of snow on that lot. The house was set back from the road and had a long driveway. The first weird thing was there were appliances, stoves, washers, dryers, refrigerators, just lining the driveway on either side. The house itself was a big house and a split level. Front door, when you go in, you can go up the few steps to the main area or down the few steps to the bottom level. There were no steps to get into the front door, so we went to the side. The door was already kicked in and snow blowing to the inside. The house was completely gutted. We went in, and there were those really tall Jesus candles you can get from like the dollar store lining the hallway on both sides. Had to be close to 100 in total, and went up the stairs to the front door, continued up the other steps, and stopped in front of a door a little to the right of the kitchen, which was at the top of the steps. There was heavy plastic, like layers, it was thick, acting as a door so we couldn't see in the room. We decided to go check it out, so we pushed the plastic aside to go in. The room was small, and there was a small folding table set up in the middle of the room, with 1 chair, 1 plate on the table, 1 fork, 1 spoon, and 1 cup knocked over. The room's air felt very heavy, as if whoever was there, or their last, was very depressed and sad, and maybe even took their life there, but no signs of that. There was no other furniture in the room. There was closet door that was ajar, but we heard a noise come from behind it. Thinking it was an animal or something, we opened the door and there was a black top hat on a hook and nothing else. I started to get anxiety really bad, and the heaviness of the air was getting to me. We walked out of the room through the heavy plastic, and I stopped at the top of the steps as my ex wanted to go down the hall, but I was getting too creeped out. I told him to hurry up. He was maybe 10 steps down the hall when the plastic from the doorway flew open, and I felt this big, forceful rush of air go past me and down the steps. It almost knocked me over. My ex heard the plastic move and ran toward me. Pretty much picked me up, I'm not a skinny person. And we ran down the steps and out the door back to my car. It was terrifying, That plastic could not have moved on its own. The other house I was in was not scary at all. It was almost comforting. The small house had been vacant for a long time, and the roof was collapsing in. We went in through the front door, and it was like whoever once lived there just left one day and never came back. I'm assuming it was an elderly person who died, and no one came to empty the house. Everything was still there. Medicine in the bathroom that expired in 1994, dishes were on a drying rack next to sink, wallet with ID, dentures, just everything. It was sad. We checked out the home and found tons of cool stuff, especially an old WW1 or WW2 uniform, an old sewing machine, record player with tons of records, and this old parchment paper book of records dating back to the 1890s, with railroad information and costs of materials and letters between family and friends and business transactions. It was super cool to see that. We didn't take anything, but it was neat to feel like we stepped back in time. I moved out of that area, and a couple years ago went to drive by that house, but it's not there anymore. One of my favorite hobbies is photography. So one day, while visiting Virginia for a job I was working at the time, my friend and I decided to go look for some abandoned places to take photographs of, since Halloween was just around the corner. So after some driving around and some quick phone research, we find this 1950s-era abandoned insane asylum. We couldn't find a way in, and all the door entrances were locked, boarded off, and guarded by cameras. Finally, we found an old busted window that led to what once was the kitchen. After some quick thinking, we found an old chair and hopped in. The place was super dark, wet, and cold, and as soon as I set foot down, I got the chill down my spine, as if something was there, or somebody, or something was watching me. My friend, who was a lot less shaken, wanted to go look around. I started snapping pics of things that were broken or flipped over. My friend walks down a hallway with the words, "All who enter die," written on the wall. I did not follow, but between being spooked and taking the pics, I just wasn't ready to take that step yet. It wasn't 30 seconds later, my friend comes speeding back in the room looking frightened, but trying to keep himself calm, and said, "All right, I've seen enough, let's go. Now." I said, "What happened? Did you see something?" He didn't say a word but walked past me and started climbing back out the window we came in. I was close to the hallway, and I guess my nature curiosity kicked in, so I leaned over and peeked down the hallway. At the end of the hallway was an empty chair. Something small was in the chair, looked like a ball or something. And the next thing I know, it slid off the chair and landed on the floor. I was totally freaked out. I screamed, "Oh hell no," and ran for the window. My friend was waiting on the other side, so I threw him my camera, and I leapfrogged out the window, cutting up my hands in the progress but not really caring about it. We ran back to the car, got in, and speed away. It wasn't until a few minutes and a few miles later we finally calmed down enough to talk to each other about what happened. I said, "Did you see that ball in the chair?" When I looked down the hallway, I saw something in that chair, and then it fall to the floor. My friend looked at me with shock and disbelief in his eyes and said, "It wasn't a ball. I was walking down the hallway, peeking into the empty rooms, and it was creepy seeing the flipped-over beds and stuff scattered everywhere. But when I got closer to the end of the hallway, what looked like a empty chair, a small doll sitting there. I thought I was spooky, but probably some crackhead put it there, and as soon as I thought that the doll went from sitting up to laying over, so I ran out of there. I thought I might have overreacted and maybe it was a breeze or something that knocked it over, but once you said it got knocked to the ground, I knew it could have been a breeze, and that totally freaked me out. So yeah, I know it doesn't sound very scary, but you had to been there. With the combination of cold and chills, and how quiet and secluded it was, just made a perfect condition, so be scared more than I ever have before. My ex-husband and I used to love going into old abandoned houses years ago. There was a beautiful old 2-story brick home about a mile from where we lived. The grass and trees were so grown and tall, it was hard even getting to the house. My ex managed to get a window open, and we climbed through it. It was like a time capsule. Very nice and expensive furniture and stuff everywhere. Furniture was covered with really dusty sheets. Everything looked high quality and expensive. Even the wallpaper was rich. It was creepy how it seemed like they walked away from all of it in the 1950s or 60s. The kitchen was upstairs, which was odd. But we ventured up there, and there was a huge arch opening into a gentleman's type man cave. Again, lots of expensive furniture and stuff. I stood in the archway while my ex rummaged through stuff. Off to the side of the arch was a huge mirror leaning against the wall. I used it to check my hair for spiderwebs. Took maybe 3 steps away from the mirror to tell my ex I wanted to go. It literally felt like someone was standing beside me. Took the 3 steps back to the mirror, and in bright pink lipstick were the words, "Get out." I swear on my life and the lives of my children, it was right there, and it hadn't been 2 minutes before. The mirror was only a few feet behind me the entire time, and I definitely would have seen "Get out" in bright pink lipstick a minute before. I even remember the exact shade of lipstick too. It was the kind old ladies like to wear. Well, I screamed and jumped back into a kitchen table and fell. My ex comes running over, and I am so scared I just point to the mirror, babbling like an idiot. My ex calmly got me out of there, and we never went back. He thinks I didn't notice it before, but I was all up on that mirror, so I would have absolutely noticed bright pink lipstick in the middle of it. Get cold hills every time I think about it. To support us in providing more, subscribe to the channel now. "Stay in your truck, sir," he said. "We'll handle this." I nodded and watched as they secured the area. The guy in the cap was nowhere to be seen. I hadn't seen him leave, but he wasn't around anymore. One of the officers came back to take my statement. I told him everything, including the guy I'd seen. "Did you get a good look at him?" the officer asked. "Not really," I admitted. Baseball cap, lean, maybe 6 feet tall. Didn't see his face clearly. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "All right, we'll need you to stick around for a bit." I spent the next few hours talking to the cops, repeating my story. They asked if I had any enemies or if I thought someone might be targeting me. I laughed at the absurdity. "I'm just a truck driver," I said. "Who'd want to come after me?" They didn't have an answer, but took my information and told me to stay in touch. By the time they let me go, it was well past midnight. I decided to push through the last leg of my trip. The image of that dead man burned into my mind for weeks. Couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I pulled into a rest area, I scanned the shadows for that guy in the cap, but I never saw him again. Cops never contacted me either, and I never heard if they caught the guy. Life went on. But I changed, became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I guess you could say it was a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how routine life seems, danger can be just around the corner. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile and a baseball. Couple of months after that night, I found myself on another long haul, this time through the deserts of New Mexico. It was the kind of drive that gave you too much time to think. My mind kept wandering back to that rest area, blood, and the guy in the cap. I wondered if he was still out there somewhere, looking for his next victim. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I pushed it away. I had a job to do, and I couldn't afford to get spooked. One night, I pulled into a truck stop in the middle of nowhere. It was a bigger place with a diner and a small convenience store. There were a few other trucks parked, drivers inside getting a meal or some shut-eye. I decided to grab a coffee and maybe a piece of pie, something to break the monotony of the road. As I walked into the diner, the bell above the door jingled, and a few heads turned to look at me. Truckers are a tight-knit group, always curious about a new face. I found a seat at the counter and ordered my coffee and pie. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, brought my order and struck up a conversation. "Long haul?" she asked, pouring my coffee. "Yeah," replied. "Just passing through." She nodded, wiping down the counter. "Stay safe out there." "You hear about that murder a while back? Some trucker found a guy dead at a rest stop." My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, I heard about it," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Crazy stuff." She sighed. "World's a dangerous place. Gotta watch your back." I finished my coffee and pie, paid my bill, and headed back to my truck. As I walked across the parking lot, I noticed a figure standing by one of the trucks. He was tall, lean, and wore a baseball cap. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep walking, hoping he wouldn't notice me. I climbed into my cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my mirrors. The guy was gone. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Another trucker stretching his leg. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every rest stop, every diner, I kept my eyes peeled for that guy in the cap. He never showed up again. A year later, I decided to take a break from trucking. The road had lost its charm, and I needed a change. I took a job at a local warehouse, working regular hours and sleeping in my own bed. Life was good, but I never forgot that night. One evening, I was watching the news when a story caught my attention. Another trucker had found a body at a rest stop. The victim's throat slit, just like before. The police were looking for a suspect, described as tall, lean, and wearing a baseball cap. I turned off the TV and sat in silence, the memories flooding back. I knew it was him, the same guy who had haunted my thoughts for the past year. I wondered how many other victims were out there. How many more would fall before he was caught? Life goes on. Some things stay with you. I still drive past that rest area sometimes on my way to visit family or take a trip. Can't help but glance at the bathroom door, half expecting to see that trail of dark, dried liquid leading inside. It's a reminder that no matter how safe we think we are, danger is always lurking just out of sight, and sometimes it wears a friendly smile and a baseball cap. My name is Daryl Fletcher, and this happened to me on July 17th, 2009. I was a truck driver back then, driving long hauls across the country, a job I loved and hated in equal measure. Sure, you get to see the country, but the loneliness can be a killer. Anyway, I was on a run from Kansas City to some small town in Wyoming. I can't remember the name now. The route took me through back roads where you can go hours without seeing another soul. It was getting late, the sky turning a dark purple, and I decided to pull into a rest area I knew was about an hour ahead. One of those real out-of-the-way places where the facilities are pretty much just a bathroom, a couple of vending machines. I'd been driving since dawn and needed to stretch my legs and maybe catch a quick nap for the last leg of the trip. Pulled in, parked my rig, and noticed another truck already there. A dark blue Peterbilt. I didn't think much of it. Truckers often stopped here, got out, lit a cigarette, and took a deep breath of cooling air. Felt good to be out of the cab. As I walked towards the restrooms, I noticed something odd. Trail of what looked like dark, dried liquid leading from the truck to the bathroom. At first I thought it was oil, but it was too dark and too thick. Curiosity got the better of me, so I followed the trail. It led to the restroom door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. A sickly sweet odor mixed with the usual restroom stink. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw it. Man slumped against the wall, blood everywhere. His throat had been slit, and his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. I backed out, my heart pounding. I'd never seen anything like that before. I knew I had to call the cops. My cell was dead, and the payphone outside was out of order. Typical. I ran back to my truck, hoping to use my CB radio to call for help. As I fumbled with the mic, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone was coming out of the other truck. The guy was tall and lean, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He moved with a casual confidence that set my nerves on edge. I pretended not to see him, focusing on getting a signal out. I managed to reach another trucker who promised to relay my call to the authority. As I signed off, the man approached my truck. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm and even. "Yeah, just checking my route." I lied. To support us in providing more, subscribe to the channel now. "Stay in your truck, sir," he said. "We'll handle this." I nodded and watched as they secured the area. The guy in the cap was nowhere to be seen. I hadn't seen him leave, but he wasn't around anymore. One of the officers came back to take my statement. I told him everything, including the guy I'd seen. "Did you get a good look at him?" the officer asked. "Not really," I admitted. Baseball cap, lean, maybe 6 feet tall. Didn't see his face clearly. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "All right, we'll need you to stick around for a bit." I spent the next few hours talking to the cops, repeating my story. They asked if I had any enemies or if I thought someone might be targeting me. I laughed at the absurdity. "I'm just a truck driver," I said. "Who'd want to come after me?" They didn't have an answer, but took my information and told me to stay in touch. By the time they let me go, it was well past midnight. I decided to push through the last leg of my trip. The image of that dead man burned into my mind for weeks. Couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I pulled into a rest area, I scanned the shadows for that guy in the cap, but I never saw him again. Cops never contacted me either. and I never heard if they caught the guy. Life went on, but I changed, became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I guess you could say it was a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how routine life seems, danger can be just around the corner. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile and a baseball. Couple of months after that night, I found myself on another long haul, this time through the deserts of New Mexico. To support us in providing more, subscribe to the channel now. "Stay in your truck, sir," he said. "We'll handle this." I nodded and watched as they secured the area. The guy in the cap was nowhere to be seen. I hadn't seen him leave, but he wasn't around anymore. One of the officers came back to take my statement. I told him everything, including the guy I'd seen. "Did you get a good look at him?" the officer asked. "Not really," I admitted. Baseball cap, lean, maybe 6 feet tall. Didn't see his face clearly. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "All right, we'll need you to stick around for a bit." I spent the next few hours talking to the cops, repeating my story. They asked if I had any enemies or if I thought someone might be targeting me. I laughed at the absurdity. "I'm just a truck driver," I said. "Who'd want to come after me?" They didn't have an answer, but took my information and told me to stay in touch. By the time they let me go, it was well past midnight. I decided to push through the last leg of my trip. The image of that dead man burned into my mind for weeks. Couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I pulled into a rest area, I scanned the shadows for that guy in the cap, but I never saw him again. Cops never contacted me either, and I never heard if they caught the guy. Life went on, but I changed, became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I guess you could say it was a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how routine life seems, danger can be just around the corner. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile and a baseball. Couple of months after that night, I found myself on another